Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Before we jump into today's episode, the 10-minute report Commanders, make sure you press that follow button here on Spotify. Do me a favor and rate the podcast. That helps boost it for other people to see this pop up in their feed, as well as check me out on Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. If you haven't checked out any other 10-minute report episodes, please go ahead and do that. And if you haven't and you're unfamiliar, the 10-minute report series is where I take 20 minutes of study plus my already established knowledge to create a 10-minute podcast. With that being said, let's jump into the 10-minute report on the Washington Commanders. To start things off with the Commanders report, I would just like to mention that they have a new team owner of Josh Harris and others. There's some other names, but Josh Harris is the main new majority owner. The biggest question mark for the Washington Commanders on the field comes at the quarterback position. They do not really have, both options are, question marks, to be honest. The first option, which seems like is going to have the best shot at being the starter, even from week one, is going to be second-year quarterback Sam Howell out of the University of North Carolina. It seems that Ron Rivera, as well as the rest of the Washington staff, is in and believes in Howell being able to be their guy. Last year, he appeared in one game. He had 169 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception on 57.9% completion percentage, as well as 35 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. Not horrible numbers, not great numbers. That came in a victory, I believe, in week 18 against the Cowboys. So I'm not 100% certain, but my guess would be that the Cowboys were resting some of their star players. The other quarterback on the Commanders roster is going to be Jacoby Brissett, who last year threw for 2,600 yards and 12 touchdowns, 6 interceptions on 64% completion percentage in 11 starts for the Cleveland Browns while he was filling in during the Deshaun Watson suspension. Brissett's been in the league for quite some time now and has stepped into a starting role with a couple different teams when their starting quarterbacks have gone down. I believe he started games with the Patriots, the Colts, and now the Browns. And I feel like I'm missing one there. But either way, whichever quarterback is starting, they're going to have a pretty good young wide receiver core. Their wide receiver core is on par with the Cowboys and the Eagles, who are in their own division and have good wide receiving cores. So they have scary Terry McLaurin, who last year had 1,200 yards and 5 touchdowns. Last year was rookie Jahan Dotson, had 523 yards and 7 touchdowns in his 12 games played. And then they also have Curtis Samuel, who put up a respectable 656 yards with 4 touchdowns. So they definitely have a little bit of weaponry on the outside that can hopefully help out either second-year quarterback Sam Howell or the veteran Jacoby Brissett, whichever one they decide to go with. And then at the running back position, they have Brian Robinson, who I believe was a rookie last year, had 800 yards and 2 touchdowns in the 12 games that he played. And then Antonio Gibson, who had 546 yards and 3 touchdowns on the season. Their offensive line is, I would say, very middle of the pack in terms of efficiency, in terms of success rates, things like that. And it's kind of led behind Charles Leno Jr., who they picked up before the offseason last year, towards the end of the offseason last year, after he was cut by the Chicago Bears. Leno actually turned into a pretty good player for them last season, only allowing 8 sacks. So, not spectacular, but pretty good for a guy that a different team decided to cut. Moving on to the defense of the Washington Commanders. This is where, while the Washington Commanders could potentially win themselves some games, but as you guys will see later with my record prediction, I just do not think either way that whichever quarterback they decide to start, I do not believe that they will be able to, help their team enough to compete, especially in their division. Pretty tough division with the Eagles, who are obviously one of the NFC favorites. And then the Giants and the Cowboys, who are both pretty solid programs, pretty solid teams within even their own division. But their defense could keep them in it and potentially win them a couple of extra games than I'm predicting. But that starts off with defensive end Chris Young, who actually had his 5th-year option decline this offseason. Check out my NFC 5th-year option decisions and analysis episode if you want to hear a little bit more detail about that and the rest of the NFC 5th-year options. But ultimately, it was declined because of his health. Chase Young has only played in 27 games the past 3 years, which obviously is not good. It's about half the games he's been eligible to play, I believe. But in those 27 games, he's had 75 tackles, 9 sacks, 6 forced fumbles, and 13 tackles for a loss. So the potential is definitely there. I would not be surprised if the Washington Commanders don't sign him to a deal that's worth less after the offseason. Or he could even go have himself a year and, make some money elsewhere in the league after the 2023 season. He was the Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2020, where he played most of the season, putting up a lot of the numbers previously mentioned. To go along with them, Chase Young on the defensive line, they have a pair of defensive ends that really showed out last year with Jonathan Allen, who had 65 tackles, 7.5 sacks, 16 tackles for a loss, and 2 forced fumbles, as well as defensive end Montez Sweat, who had 46 tackles, 8 sacks, and 14 tackles for a loss. So those two guys definitely are holding down the fort for them, for their defense, and setting the tone kind of for the Commanders' defense in terms of production. They do have cornerback Kendall Fuller, who last year had 52 tackles, 3 interceptions, and 2 touchdowns. So, good numbers for him. And then they picked up, they drafted in the first round of the draft, number 16 overall, out of Mississippi State, cornerback Emmanuel Forbes. Emmanuel Forbes, I would think he's going to be starting opposite of Fuller as a rookie at that cornerback position. In 3 seasons at Mississippi State, he had 94 tackles, 14 interceptions, 6 touchdowns, and 20 pass deflections. Passes defense, whichever you'd like to use for that stat. And I believe he has the NCAA FBS record for most pick sixes throughout a college career, with those 6 pick six touchdowns. So he's definitely good. The Commanders' defensive line, along with 2 pretty good cornerbacks, could potentially keep them in some games. I just think that the Commanders' offense with their mid-level offensive line and question marks at quarterback, which if it's Brissett starting, unless Brissett has some major improvements that we haven't seen in his careers thus far, he's going to be an average to below average starter. And I would predict that in Sam Howell's first complete year as a starter, it would probably be, below average at best, just based off of what we've seen from the majority of quarterbacks, especially those not starting right away. So we're approaching our 10-minute mark here on this episode, which leaves me with just one thing left, and that is the 2023 record prediction for the Washington Commanders, where I predict that they will go 4-13. Thank you all for listening. Like I said at the beginning, please make sure you check out all of my other episodes and follow me here on Spotify. Thanks again, and go Ravens.